Chapter 5. Their son. The king and queen both fell ill in their 60th year, and passed away a few days later, entering their true journey within minutes of each other. On the final day, they asked me to serve their son with the same passion as I had served them. I swore I would, cursed be my tongue. That day, sorrow among the Arorites such as not been observed for hundreds of years flowed from every soul, and the following years only further shattered the heart of Error. Verse 5 of the Confessional Monolith.
You are certainly wise for a Genronite, Lord Sernir.
Thesseling stood up from the table of the great hall and bowed to Seth in his typical insincere manner.
Thank you kindly for your idea. Now, I've no more time to waste here. These special customizable carvings must be completed before the beginning of the festival.
That Thesseling was tiring to talk with indeed. At least the issue between the snobby Carfelian and Officer Jorium had been peacefully resolved. The woodcarver had promised to make amends by both apologizing with words and providing Jorium's son with a free carving. In return, Seth had granted Thesseling the high-paying job of crafting commemorative vessels and toys to be given as rewards for the victors of certain games held at the celebrational feast. Seth whispered a prayer to the High Keepers that nothing would reignite that man's pride before that day arrived. As Thesseling walked out of the great hall and down the stairs to the main gate bathed in noontime sunlight, Seth stood up and stretched. Fortunately, there seemed to be no one else seeking an audience. After nearly 3 hours of hearing and discussing various concerns and complaints, Seth's back had grown a bit stiff, but it was worth it knowing that the valley was content. At least, he hoped it was. His glance passed by the triple fortress emblem of the stewards on the table, where their response had arrived yesterday, and a chill danced along his spine. 2 weeks had passed since Seth had sent his threatening message to the outskirt stewards, and the phantom of the potential rebellious reaction that could have arisen had plagued Seth for several days. Fortunately, when the dreaded response had arrived, it barely held a hint of anger towards Seth. It didn't have any sort of apology for the first message, but it was a simple acceptance of Seth's rule over the stewards and the valley. If the will of Lord Sernir is so, then the will of Lord Sernir shall be done. It was better than he'd hoped, but there was still a worry rotting within. How could he know for sure they would be true to their word? He hoped to speak to them in person at the celebrational feast, though the thought of a sudden attempt at a coup was concerning. Seth sighed, banishing the thoughts for the 11th time that week. No, if they tried that while in full view of the Carfelians, they would be known as brutish traitors unfit to rule, and authority would never be regained in the valley. The outskirt stewards were intelligent. They wouldn't do anything so rash. Seth couldn't help but think of his father's secret once more. If only its security was in his grasp, this dilemma would evaporate like the dawn frost. Preparations for the feast had engulfed most of Seth's time, but any extra hours he had were spent trying to discover the hidden location of that mysterious secret. He had reviewed all of the historical texts about the travels of the Sernir clan from Mistbay to the Carfelian Valley, and asked Madame Aethel, Valmir, and other elders to tell him details of that journey and the building of the citadels, albeit sporadically and never directly, to ensure they didn't understand his true goal. If they simply thought he was putting together old traditions and recording odd anecdotes, there wouldn't be any concern about Seth's ignorance about the Sernir family secret. Though he had learned that the first harvest feast following their arrival featured the flesh of the finned lake wolves dressed in peargrass sauce, and of the storytelling contest which put his father's Carfelian language skills to the test, there hadn't been much that could provide clues regarding the secret. However, one of the stories held a detail which prodded at his mind more than the others. When the Arorite architect was still assisting with the construction of the fortresses in the valley, certain sections of the land were inadvertently pushed up due to the twisting and growing foundations of the underground sections of the buildings. It even caused the upheaval of a few large boulders, the biggest of which emerged a few hundred feet away from the growing fortress, and was later carved into a statue in the town square. To both the Sernir clan and the Carfelians, it was a unique sight, though it still took a few years for the fortresses to become the citadels they were today. Great snake dens, they'd been called at first. Seth wasn't sure how to feel about his home being referred to as such, though since it was a connotation that had all but disappeared, he decided not to dwell on it. However, the foundations themselves remained mostly a mystery. The twisting tunnels that formed in these foundations were unique to each citadel, sharp and labyrinthine contrasts to the extreme uniformity of the stone above ground. After hearing that 2 of the inhabitants of the mountain citadel had become lost in the twisting tunnels underneath, Lord Cernier I called for them to be sealed off, only to be used sparsely, and even then, only for unusual cases. The mysterious foundations were there to unite the Ararian culture to the land of Caerfell and ensure the citadel's stability. No more than that. The architect had disagreed. As to why, no one knew exactly, since he swore and shouted in Aurori Prime, but he eventually set up bronze doorways as the only entrance into the strange tunnels in each of the citadels, in a chamber at the end of a path underneath the Great Hall stairwell in every one. Soon it was added to the schedule that the foundations should only be opened in the case of emergency. Seth had only been down in those tunnels once, when his father was testing the lock on the now gold-embroidered bronze door, and had desired for Seth to witness how it worked. Unfortunately, he could scarcely remember anything from the lesson, as Seth was too preoccupied with the yawning darkness beyond the doors to focus. He wasn't able to sleep soundly for weeks due to his imagination conjuring foul creatures and spirits lurking in the deepest recesses of his home. Since then, Seth had realized there was nothing unnatural to fear, especially with the excellent craftsmanship of the doorway so early on, but the idea of the maze-like underground was still unnerving to say the least. How far must it reach beneath if it was able to dislodge boulders under even the town square? It was almost certainly the perfect place to store the secret, and if not the thing itself, perhaps a clue that would lead Seth to understanding it. He'd just need to find a way to do so without causing concern. If he could find a problem that needed to be addressed as an excuse, no one would give it a moment's thought. A wry smile flitted on his face as he realized that finding pointless issues is precisely the sort of thing he was good at. If there happened to be a massive increase in the population of the fortress, perhaps nearly a fourfold rise in number, then it would be essential to have a map of the labyrinth to properly house them. However, such a thought was ridiculous and certainly not at the forefront of potential concerns. Instead, maybe he should do as his father did, and begin another test of the doorway's capabilities, investigating a little further ahead during the process. That shouldn't cause too much suspicion. Even the shadowed pathway behind the stairwell was properly tidied at least once a week according to the schedule, and it served as a storage room for different tableware, be it decorative crests for the feasts with the outskirt stewards, or wooden parts to replace or repair faulty chairs, all kept beneath coverings of cloth. However, the bronze doorway set on the far end of the antechamber directly beneath the center of the main hall was never covered, as it needed to be shined and polished each week, lest it rust or diminish. Such a task had already been accomplished yesterday, and as Seth walked down the passage, he admired the organization of every item kept down there. The schedule truly did keep everything in the citadel running like a tuned furnace, even these out-of-the-way areas. The very same schedule that he was bending to its limits by entering the foundations. He paused for a moment as guilt seized him. Could he really say that his concerns about the outskirt stewards were equal to an emergency? Such a thing, as far as Seth knew of it, meant the imminent danger of an Erorite or Caerfellian, not the wild worries of a paranoid poser. If he was willing to bend the rules for himself here, he might very well end up causing catastrophe in the future on a childish whim, destroying the orderly essence of his father's will. Seth nodded in resolution. The schedule was to be followed to the end. He could test the gate and even open it, but he would not send anyone down there yet. If the situation with the stewards became worse, he would travel to the very depths of them himself, but he would not bring unnecessary chaos to his father's rule. Satisfied with his thoughts, he entered the antechamber. When he was a child, the bronze doorway had towered over him with an austere dominance. Now that he had grown, it seemed smaller, but every tiny detail of interlocking patterns and pieces flush with symbols and picturesque lines across its doors and frame made them more mystifying than ever. Seth drew his hand across it, marveling at the craftsmanship. 15 spinning cylinders of metal embossed with stiff lines, laid out in 3 sets of 5 across the face of the doorway, were the key to forming a set yet short word in Aurori Prime. If even one of the cylinders was turned incorrectly, the whole door would remain sealed shut, as if it was nothing more than a decorative wall. In old iterations of the schedule, a hint for the word was written: the key for the peace of the valley. Immediately, the thought of the schedule itself had rushed into Seth's head, but if the doorway could only create words of up to a scant handful of insignias, then such a word would be too long. Seth frowned as another concern arose upon seeing the complexity of the design. How could he know if there was a failsafe for someone simply trying every word they could possibly imagine? Eventually they would get it right, and the door would fly open, hardly a defense worthy of error. No, there had to be more to it than what simply met the eye. Seth tried to peer into the inner workings of the door, attempting to catch a glimpse of the toothed wheels and sticks that clicked and spun as he turned one of the central cylinders slightly. Unfortunately, only the dust on the far side of the embossed object was revealed, dust that may have been accumulating for nearly 12 years. It moved so smoothly as well, where the simple hinges of the usual Citadel doors would often catch and whine only days after being oiled. As he mentally linked the vertical and horizontal line that crossed the cylinder with the twisting curves on the cylinders to the top and bottom, much of his practice reading Aurori Prime came rushing back to him. The long hours spent in the archives reading the history of the massive empire and the lords who served it had slowly made him able to read the looping text on paper that could be written as stiff symbols in stone. Together, these 3 cylinders had become a symbol which approximated T in the Arorite tongue of Mistbay. He smiled. Justifying the excessive hours he'd spent reading in the past 10 years to Madame Athel would be quite the fulfilling experience. Now to decipher the word that fit the one clue he had, the key for the peace of the valley. Seth rubbed his chin, staring at the doorway. If schedule was too long, then perhaps what it represented would do the trick. After all, the schedule's essence of predictability and fixed nature kept at bay its very antithesis, the chaos born from anger and irrationality. That essence, order, would just fit if he utilized an unorthodox spelling of it from the northern reaches of the old empire. He reached forward to spin the cylinders to match it, but paused just before his fingers touched the metal. He frowned. Something about that logic felt incorrect. If he made 2 concessions to force a word like order, how could that be a simple and satisfactory answer to his father's clue? Maybe he should look at this in another way entirely. If this doorway hadn't been moved since his father's time, perhaps the answer was already almost complete. He traced his finger along the remaining cylinders, making out 2 more phrases of dual letters, each translated into ra and ying, respectively. With the first fifth already tr, it made an approximation of throng. Throng. A host of people, usually with a single purpose in mind. Yes, that could work. It brought about notions of peace and unity, and it was very close to what the doorway had said at the beginning. Taking a deep breath, Seth placed both hands on the central line of the door and pushed. He remembered his father had simply exerted a tiny amount of force at the center, and the door had swung as if yanked by aggressive servants desperate to outdo each other. If this word was right, then the amount of effort Seth was giving would be more than enough. To his dismay, the door remained shut. Blast, it had remained as steadfast as solid stone. There hadn't even been a shudder. At the very least, it hadn't activated some sort of secondary seal inside the metal construct, locking it away forever. He had another chance. As he breathed in relief, Seth felt a little silly. Of course his father wouldn't have left the doorway practically open after testing it. He was too smart to leave such a weakness. But if not throng, and likely not order, what could the answer be? The key for the peace of the valley. Seth murmured to himself, turning over in his mind the question in many different ways to see if any would elicit the facilitator for a war-free existence that his father had thought of. Citadel, or something akin to that such as home. No, that was either too long or too vague. Power, courage, or wisdom? Each had potential, but his father was well balanced in all 3, so how could it be just one that would be the key for the peace of the valley? As Seth pondered, the cloudiness of so many options bred a small, humorous idea that started as a joke, the sort that is created unconsciously to provide a weary mind with necessary levity, but it continued to grow more and more as other options failed him. What if Seth's father saw himself as the key, and simply answered the door with, me? It would be using almost none of the outer cylinders, instead made up of a simple symbol of a diamond in a diamond, which represented one's own self, only in the central column. After all, he was the only one who was expected to use it anyway. Was such a humorously simple answer the solution after all? Almost in spite of himself, Seth began to turn one of the outer cylinders. He moved slowly, leaning against the door and listening closely to the almost imperceptible ticks and clicks behind it. Soon, an empty, unembossed side began to appear, decorated only with the ancient dust. His heart pounded. Why? Was he afraid? He ignored the thought and continued, focusing with greater intensity. As the cylinder reached the final point, showing its barren side fully, a single click much louder than the others sounded from the door, and Seth froze. Something had activated, and with only one cylinder altered and no legible words being spelled now, The worry that there had been some sort of security measure against those foolish enough to guess was rising. Would he dare try again? Was it already too late? Maybe if he were to turn back the cylinder to its previous point, it would reverse the damage. He quickly spun it around and listened carefully for another wretched sound.
"Oh, come on now, Lord Cernier!"
A loud young voice jolted him out of his rising concern, intensifying it into fear before he whirled around and it dissolved into embarrassment. Moni, Mari's twin brother, was sitting on the floor in the middle of the antechamber with an annoyed look on his face, a hook pole laying across his lap.
"You finally turn one stone thing after 10 minutes, and then immediately go back on it. I was going completely batty just watching that."
Though a small part of Seth felt that he should reprimand the child for such flagrant speech, his thoughts were more focused on the shock that he had been squatting in the corner like a fiddling rat for so long. Besides, Moni did refer to him with the proper title, which was more than could be said for his sister. 10 minutes? Was it really that long? Wait, why were you standing silently behind me for that whole time? That's a lot of questions. Moni looked up at the ceiling as if in thought, then shook his head.
Nah, I guess it was only really closer to 2 or 3 minutes I've been here.
Seth breathed a sigh of relief. Good, at least he wasn't going completely mad.
But I couldn't just say something, Lord Cernier, sir, or else you would have stopped, and I really want to know what's behind that door.
He lifted the pole up.
Oh, and this is what I came here for. I left it here yesterday, and I need it for stabbing sea monsters with Mari and the others.
Seth blinked in confusion. Sea monsters? Are you referring to fish, or... Moni shook his head with a grin.
Nope. Old man Valmir was telling us about how when he was little, he'd go on a boat into a huge lake so big you couldn't see the land on the other side, and then he'd hunt huge snakes bigger than the citadel that lived deep down in the water. He was awesome!
That made sense. Valmir's stories of the open waters beyond the shores of Mist Bay, the old home of the Cernier clan, were certainly exciting, and all entirely unrealistic. The biggest sea snake that had ever been caught had been carefully taxidermied, and its 15-foot-long body now hung from the roof of the Citadel archive. To think that one 100 times larger existed was both ridiculous and terrifying. Nevertheless, the games they inspired were safe enough. Valmir said all that, did he? Well, that should be fine, just be careful not to go to any of the deeper parts of the river. If it's running above your knees, seek higher ground, all right? Moni frowned and thought for a moment.
How about this? If you open up that doorway so I can go in there just for a bit, then I'll make sure we all stay by the shore.
He presented his absurd deal in a rather matter-of-fact tone, and though the Cernier blood in him caused Seth to be a little impressed at the shrewdly direct method, he scoffed at the notion. No, of course not. The only reason anyone will walk through that doorway is due to an emergency of unprecedented calamity. Besides, why in the world would you want to go there? A disappointed look crossed Moni's face, but he continued.
My mama is always saying that there's nothing but worms and gooey mud in there, and that I can just find stuff like that outside by the river. But if it's locked up, they've got to be really special worms, and I'll need at least one to lure out a giant sea snake so I can hunt it.
Maybe there are just worms, as your mother says, but maybe there's something more dangerous that has been kept secret. My father, Lord Cernier I, set these rules in place for a reason. He gestured towards the door with a wide motion, and tried to put on a tone of voice with greater gravitas. There are those who entered these sorts of places, and they never returned. You don't want to be added to that number, Moni. To avoid it, you would do well to follow my father's good advice. There, that sounded lordly enough.
Moni squinted with an incredulous air. How good can someone's advice be if they're dead? It didn't seem to help him much there.
The blunt and quite frankly disrespectful phrase jolted Seth out of his solemn tone.
Well, of course it did. What, do you think he died because of something in the Foundations? Don't be absurd. You should apologize right away. Do you understand?
The boy looked startled at his sudden shift in demeanor, and instantly Seth felt ashamed. Moni's response hadn't been said out of hatred or contempt of Lord Cernier I. He simply spoke with the simple logic of a child because he was one. Seth raised his hand. No, wait. I should apologize before anything else. I shouldn't have let myself become so aggravated at a thoughtless comment. You must understand that what happened to Lord Cernier I was a misfortune that couldn't have been prevented by the most brilliant advice in all the world. Even if he has passed on, his words will keep us safer than we could have ever hoped for otherwise. That makes sense, doesn't it? Why had Seth gotten so upset at that? There was no truth to Moni's words, was there? Moni nodded slowly. Right. So you're saying that's a no to the whole underground worm hunt, then? Seth sighed and shook his head. That's correct, Moni. No worm hunt here. He turned back to the doorway to continue the investigation. I'm sure you'll find some excellent bait out by the river. Just be watchful for signs of lake wolves. Got it? Moni gasped and snapped his fingers. Ah, you just reminded me. Some of the Monster Hunter troop guys told Old Man Volmir that there was a really smart one on the loose. A lake wolf, I mean. And that they were going to tell you all about it, but then decided not to until after it was taken care of, since they didn't want to make you even more jumpy with how close it's getting. I figured, but he's the Lord, why not tell him today? But I forgot until now. Okay, bye, Lord Cernir. As Moni dashed up the hallway, Seth simply stared after him for a moment in stunned silence. How could this be happening? Not only was the faltering respect for the title of the Lord starting to reach beyond Seth and into his father's legacy, but even the older generation were aware of his own failures to rule and treated him like a fragile child who would break upon any adversity. What scared Seth the most was the fact that they may have been right. The bronze doorway remained shut with no answer in sight. The threat of the outskirts steward still loomed, and even the feast itself was now in jeopardy because of a monster too smart for its own good. As all of these threats swirled around in his mind, a single mote of light shone from the center of it all, growing into a blazing beam of emotion. No, Seth would not simply cower away like always. Moni's words had shown him just how dire his constant failure was, so he would face these challenges head on and find a way to prevail against every single one of them. Even if he could not do it himself, there would be at least one person who would have an idea. It is all the very least he should be doing if he wanted to uphold his father's legacy. Seth took a deep breath and began striding forward. First, he would talk to the guards and get to the bottom of this dangerous lake wolf business. He would find a way to fix this, and prove that his method wouldn't simply entail calling off the feast for fear of the creature. A tinge of embarrassment at the realization that he had considered it for half a second prodded at his mind, but he shook his head to clear it. If he couldn't improve here and now, then he never would. Though the afternoon shadows were stretching on ever earlier across the sandy training ground as the cold weather grew stronger, many of the guards were still practicing under the watchful eyes of their captains. Volmir was but one of several who helped ensure that the young men of the Citadel were in proper form for the safe removal of threats to the village, even if that mostly meant just carrying the heavy traps to and from dangerous grounds across the valley. Fighting the beasts in the wilds was almost entirely a thing of the past, one which Seth was very happy to leave there. Sure, it had turned a somewhat glamorous job into yet another source of general labor on the schedule, but the nasty claw and bite wounds that some of the guards from Seth's youth had returned with had not been seen for nearly 10 years. The traps themselves, though simple, were wonderfully clever. A square kennel made of close bars of steel opened on one side to allow its prey to enter, usually for some sort of bait within. As they stepped onto a panel in the center, a lifted door would be released, and fall within a one-way lock that could only be opened by lifting a knob up and outward at the same time from outside. Afterward, spears could either neutralize a dangerous creature, or it could be released somewhere else. If there was some threat that was evading these traps, that would be quite worrisome, as not many other methods of safeguarding the valley were being practiced nowadays. The rigors of carrying such heavy objects across uneven terrain were what the majority of training sessions nowadays entailed, such as the one happening before Seth right now. An unnaturally deep voice was shouting in quick bursts out over the training grounds. Now then, drop knees, steady shoulders. 1, 2, 3, rise. Squad 3, even it out. Squad 1, you're too close to the cage. Move yourselves or be bitten. It seemed Captain Hinault Trevin was leading the training tonight. Though his family had been servants of one of the Allures defeated by Seth's father, they had sworn loyalty to Clan Cernir, and had introduced much more grit and effort into the guards' training than anyone else. Whether or not it was an excess of such grit, well, that was a little less certain. However, despite the grumblings from some of the less motivated guards, it was probably a good part of why there had been no injuries. That was worth the guilt Seth felt at the common sight of the spread of exhausted bodies on the ground after the practices had ended. Some of that guilt would be lessened today, as the training would have to be cut short. Seth waved to Hinault, motioning him to come over. The guard nodded his understanding before turning back to the winded trainees. Our Lord has granted a reprieve for now. Stand to! Seth nodded at them in approval as they struggled to reach their full height after setting down the stone-filled kennels, still taking heavy breaths from the recent exertion.
Greetings, everyone. Be at ease. I've simply come with a few private queries for Captain Hinault. Hinault narrowed his eyes in concern, but shouted back, You heard, Lord Cernier. At ease? I will return shortly, and in the meantime, Guardsman Allais is in charge. Practice organized spear striking for now. He motioned Seth over to one of the shadowed corners of the sandy court and spoke in quick, hushed tones. What might this be about, your lordship? Something urgent, I take it?
Seth tried to put on a confident tone, which was harder than expected given that Captain Treven's intense stare almost made Seth feel like he was the one being tested. I'm afraid that my ears and eyes are more attentive than you may think, Captain. I am already aware of the monstrously intelligent lake wolf, the one who has been growing ever closer to the village each day, somehow avoiding our traps all the while. I want to know why this has not been told to me, especially given the danger it presents to the Carfelians in the outer village. Though Hinault's eyes barely changed, he seemed to relax a bit, chuckling slightly and almost pityingly before saying, Your lordship, I'm afraid you've gotten some strange sort of idea about what's been happening. Yes, there seems to be an issue with one of the trapping grounds, as it's had all of the bait taken amidst a whole host of water-dweller tracks smattered about untouched cages. But it's miles away from the village, and it could very well be nothing more than an odd occurrence. Seth immediately felt both relief and a rush of crimson humility. He had taken a wild rumor spread by a child as an absolute report, and had tried to use it in a swaggering manner. Hinault continued, I'll try to keep pointless rumors to a minimum, so as not to give you any more unnecessary palpitations. Seth could feel the mocking sympathy in those words, and almost bowed in apology and shame. However, there was something of the fire that had ignited within him still smoldering. Not only that, the rising rebelliousness of the outskirt stewards brought a shadowy concern regarding Captain Hinault, whose father served the former lord of Lake Eye's citadel. If there was a show of strength between Seth and the stewards, who would he choose to follow? If he continued to treat Seth with pity, then the young lord only had himself to blame. Besides, there was a definite reason to be concerned about this lake wolf threat, one that had bypassed the guards, however small and seemingly trifling it was. As it manifested in Seth's mind, he spoke again, albeit without the showy tone he had begun with, as it had been excessively ridiculous in retrospect. That's good to hear, but I'm not fully satisfied. The fact that the cages were untouched is troubling. Were they broken or misused in any way? Hinault blinked, and Seth felt a little relieved as the captain seemed caught off guard. Well, no, I suppose not. Seth continued, his confidence growing. That's strange, isn't it? In the past, there were cases where the cage door latches had worn away and had fallen off, but if they are still in excellent condition, then the creatures must have figured out some way to use it as we do. The heavy spear Hinault carried tapped against the ground with a determined rhythm. I believe I can see what you're getting at, your lordship. Shall I go with the squad and take care of this creature in the old ways of the valley? Was the eagerness in his voice just because of his desire to rectify his oversight? Seth shook his head. No, as you said, it is not yet an extraordinary threat to the Carfelians, so I will not put your lives in unnecessary risk. We may just need to change the design of the traps, even if only temporarily, to trap this beast. After all, we only need to succeed once, and I am sure the Forge families would be happy to oblige. Hinault glanced over at the younger guards, all practicing what seemed to be simple thrusts and steps. I feel such an endeavor would be wasteful of the fine men here, as I am certain the Forge families are busy as usual on your commerce, and require no more extra work. Is the position of guardsman simply one of transition between better pursuits in your eyes, Lord Cernier? So that was his meaning. Where Seth saw only potential pain and unnecessary danger, Hinault saw a chance for archaic glory and prestige. How many of the elders' stories told of the daring defenses the guards of the citadels performed in the early years of the valley? And yet, such stories were only created out of a world that was yet to be conquered and safeguarded. How could Seth allow a regression to that time, simply due to phantasmal desires for fame? But even as he thought this, Seth knew that it would only be seen as weakness. Should he allow one foolish exception to the schedule for the sake of illusory peace? No, there would have to be some other way to appease this desire of Captain Treven which didn't involve slipping back to the days of chaos. For now, perhaps a compromise was in order. Seth cleared his throat. The strength of the guards is a unique and essential element of the safety of all in the valley, but for that reason I will not waste it in pointless escapades. However, if you wish to win special esteem for those under you, bring this intelligent lake wolf back to me alive.
Such a creature may be valuable to study. In truth, Seth wasn't sure if a lake wolf was possible to contain and study as Sergiano's plants were, but he hoped it would be enough to persuade Hinault. The captain sighed in disappointment, but his form seemed slightly less tense.
I suppose that makes enough sense. If you want this thing alive, then we shall ensure that it will be brought in still thrashing and fresh.
He turned about and began to walk back to the training ground, pausing for just a moment and glancing back to say,
Just remember that we are capable of more. If those sootbeards can't help you, then we will uphold our oath to keep the valley safe.
Despite everything Seth had considered during the conversation, he still felt that he had failed somewhat. The gnawing worry was beginning to grow again, but Seth pushed it down. He would need all the courage he could muster to speak in a proper manner with the Forge families, the powerful metalworkers whose skill and alliance had granted the Cernier family such mercantile power for several generations. They hadn't expressed any rebellious tendencies, and yet if even the guards of the Citadel were speaking with such concern at Seth's rule, who knows what might be at the brink of collapse.